Next from Springfield, Attorney Aaron Maduff, who successfully represented state employees and retirees in their lawsuit against the state over pension reform, comments on the proposal of taxing retirement income as a means to reduce the state's pension debt and the anxiety many Illinois pensioners feel over the future solvency of their pension benefits. This runs about 15 minutes.
Aaron Maduff, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois channel. As we are here in the middle of June, the Supreme Court famously gave a decision earlier this year that the reforms to the pension bill were unconstitutional. One of the interesting things that happened more recently was Governor Rauner announced in one of his cabinet meetings that the reform, his backup plan for pension reform, which would have been to apply it on a forward-going basis to incomes, he has announced in the cabinet meeting that he now thinks, in lieu of the Supreme Court decision, that what he had intended to do would also be unconstitutional. So apparently for now, legislative approaches to reforming or trying to recover some of the costs of pensions are over as far as rewriting the laws. But let me ask you this. What about the idea that the legislature could apply a tax to pensions? And there had already been discussion vis-a-vis that Illinois is one of the few states in the nation that doesn't tax retirement income. Could that not be done?
This is an interesting concept, and I have to preface everything with the idea that I'd have to see the law, or at least a bill that tells me what it is that we're trying to do. And from there, you sort of begin the analysis. And one of the things that makes it complicated is Governor Rauner has obviously figured out, and you and I talked about this going back to the campaigns, and he had a particular theory that he wanted to apply it to work going forward. And I told you at that time that I felt pretty strongly that that would not be constitutional because once you're in the system, you're in the system. He seemed to be pretty strong in terms of that was the way he wanted to approach it, and I think perhaps some of his campaign promises were based on that approach. The Supreme Court, I think, bought our arguments. They came down pretty soundly on it, and what he has just said is he's read the Supreme Court opinion. He's concluded what we had concluded before, but now the Supreme Court has said it rather than me saying, which of course is a big difference, and it's not going to work that way. So what it really comes down to is we've got a pretty comprehensive opinion from the Supreme Court. Remember that it is very well thought out. It includes from 2 briefs. We filed our own, but the other groups also filed a brief. And then it included a lot of stuff that the justices obviously researched on their own and added on their own. And it was apparent that the justices really knew the situation from the oral arguments. Justice Thomas was reading from pre-written questions. He knew exactly what was on his mind and what he wanted to get addressed. So there was obviously a lot of research that had been done. So we have I think it's like 38 pages, a very comprehensive opinion that we can drill down to analyze any particular situation. Now, I don't have the presentation of the taxing suggestion that you have. My gut instinct is that anytime you say we're going to use something, whether it's a tax or something else, such as, for example, health insurance premiums, to diminish pension, we're going to run into issues with the pension protection clause. And so if we come in and we say, look, we're going to tax it and thereby recover the money, I think we can all honestly say, look, all you're really trying to do is find a way to put into nice words or some different mechanism to do the very same thing. Take the money out of the pensioners' pockets and put it back into the state's pockets, and I think that that can run afoul of the pension protection clause. Having said that, again, I need to review the material. I think that there is a problem here. I think that the proper parties, which probably should include some of us as the attorneys who worked on this and understand this at this point, should probably sit down together and try to come to a conclusion that we think is constitutional, because if we end up with a question, we're going to end up back where we started. And I think that certainly as I've looked at the various plaintiffs' attorneys and groups that we've worked with, there's certainly a willingness to fight if that's what it takes.
And as we are here covering the SUAA State University Annuitants Association Conference representing the retirees from state universities, Ralph Martiri was one of the speakers. He runs the Center for Budget and Accounting. One of the things that he had mentioned, again, was that Illinois was one of the few states and he was looking for new revenues, and he would say if we were to tax retirement income in Illinois, based upon his numbers, it could raise as much as $1 billion. So I guess I'm re-asking a little bit of what I asked before, and I know you're not a tax attorney, but obviously the legislature has the ability to apply a tax. Other states have taxed retirement income, Illinois being one of the few thus far who hasn't. So have you thought at all further as far as if they were to apply that tax, it would, I guess I would be arguing that it doesn't seem like it would be in violation of a diminishment, because if one was getting a $50,000 pension, you would be taxed on the $50,000, so they're not really cutting the amount that's credited to you, they're just applying a tax to it.
I think that there are ways to use taxes if they are indeed taxes. But I think that if you say we're going to tax pensions, all you're doing is giving a label to something that is a diminishment. Because the net effect is to say we're going to give you less than the pension. The net effect is we're going to diminish the pension. That's all it really comes down to. Now, a general tax that covers everything, I mean, I'd have to take a look at the pieces. Again, I need the bill in front of me. I think there are ways to do it. I don't know that taxes are the only way to do it. I think taxes present their own individual problems in terms of how you would cover it. But I think that what the legislature needs to do is it needs to look for ways to pay what the state owes, rather than focusing on how do we lower the state's obligation under these pensions, is how do we meet our obligations. If we're using a tax to bring in revenue to meet obligations, I think that depending on how it's written, I'd have to take a look at it and what it's covering. Potentially there might be some legitimacy to that. But if you have something that has the net effect simply of diminishing the pension, what you're really doing is you're back to attacking the pension, trying to figure out how not to pay the pension, as opposed to how to meet the state's fiscal issues.
As you've been here addressing some of those in attendance, have they had any questions for you as a follow-up to their pensions? And just to what extent would you say, in talking to those who get state pensions, to what extent do they still have maybe a level of anxiety about the safety of those pensions?
There's still a significant level of anxiety. The reality is that the state is facing something like a $100 billion pension crisis that it has not yet resolved. And the rhetoric coming from at least Governor Rauner and portions of the General Assembly, I don't want to speak for everybody, is still a matter of we need to figure out how to deal with that pension crisis. So long as that is the discussion, then there's a fear that something is going to happen to go after pensions, and we need to be prepared to fight it. And I think that's what people are beginning to recognize, that this is round one. This is not over. Certainly the legislature has the ability to pass a law that it knows is unconstitutional and try to put it into effect before we go in or somebody else goes in and gets an injunction or fights it. And that may be what they're thinking. I don't know. Certainly this organization has shown its willingness to fight, and it's preparing for those fights. But I think that the real question is, are we going to get to the point where the rhetoric shows that we're no longer looking to, as a state, avoid the pension obligations, but rather looking for a way to pay them? And if they're doing that, and that's the effort, then I think that so long as the people who have the interests are involved, and those people who understand the issues are involved, it's possible to negotiate something.
I'll just point out a quick statistic for the viewers that we, in about 2002, so not really all that long ago, I think about 5% of the state's operating budget went to make pension payments. Now in 2015, a full 25% or so of the state's operating budget is going to pay pensions. So it is really sucking up a lot of the money that might otherwise have gone to education and transportation, et cetera. That's not to say the state doesn't owe it. It just goes to show the illustration of the financial strain it's putting on operating other departments of government and why the state is looking in some ways for relief. But obviously they also have that constitutional clause that says pensions cannot be diminished, and so here we are. If the governor and the legislators were continuing to look for a solution, I imagine they are, what about drawing in yourself and maybe some of the other attorneys that were arguing over the problems with the previous attempt to say, is there another way to get to where we need to go to maintain the state budget and yet at the same time find some constitutional way to ease the pain on the state's operating income?
I think that's a great idea. I think that whenever you bring both sides of an issue together, that you have the ability of taking the combined wisdom of everybody who's involved. I would have to, again, see what the proposals are. I would be delighted to work with those proposals and try to modify those proposals and give my thoughts if that were the case. But I think that we have to maintain our perspective that everybody has a constituency that they have to represent. I go back to looking 100 years back, and these pensions were underfunded going back to, I think, 1917. That's what we discussed in the briefings. Is it putting pressure on other portions of state government, whether it's education or other interests? Perhaps, but let me look at it from a slightly different perspective. Perhaps monies that were spent in the 1990s or taxes that weren't taken in the 1990s, monies that were spent on other things that we may or may not have needed or were I've seen comments where I think Governor Rauner in one recent statement noted that there have been failures to competitively bid projects, for example. Well, those kinds of things may also be putting pressure on the budget. And if they weren't there, then perhaps these obligations would have been met or more met, and we wouldn't be in this situation. So I think you have to look at that budget really as a whole. I don't think you can say we need to deal with the pension problem. I think you need to say we need to deal with the budgetary problem.
Well, Aaron Maduff, we won't speculate anymore, but we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us and share your thoughts. I'm sure we'll have another opportunity in the future to do this again.
My pleasure.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.